This is an experiment. It's the first time I've tried to make a video in this fashion, so please bear with me. Star Trek. I grew up with Star Trek in the 1970s as reruns. As created by Gene Roddenberry, a visionary, Star Trek set a standard for science fiction that is impossible to ignore or avoid. Even as an adult, sitting down and trying to write my own science fiction stories, you have to intentionally try to not appear derivative because the standard was set so readily by Gene Roddenberry. Anytime you put people in space, traveling, exploring, it's inevitable that there's going to be comparisons. It's inevitable that it's going to feel somewhat like it. It's hard to not be a ripoff because this guy really set the standard in motion. But Star Trek, as much as it's about strange new worlds, exploring space, optimistic future, all of these things that it's known for, the real thing that made it work, that made it sellable, marketable, that really gave it the power it developed culturally to begin with, was how good the formula was for the human characters, the humanity of the experience of how they interacted, their friendships, their relationships. Of course, volumes have been written about this, but it's just a great story with compelling characters and all of that other positive stuff that gets translated into the next generation and future incarnations of Star Trek, at least until recently. All of that optimistic ideology, that hopeful looking towards the future, as important as that is, that was really secondary to the original sale. The original sale of the concept and the show was really in the characters. I'm going to start sort of at the bottom, so to speak. There's a circle around Captain Kirk, and others have described this, and I'm going to do it in brief detail. Captain Kirk, of course, is Horatio Hornblower. Gene Roddenberry said this himself. The classic Captain adventure, can do anything, can pull your fat out of the fire no matter what the risk. The guy who saves the day. Captain James T. Kirk is sort of the center, and around we have this support crew. But we have Mr. Spock and Dr. McCoy are the right and left-hand men of the captain. Mr. Scott, the engineer, is sort of in the middle. He's this fulcrum between the upper level and the lower level. Beneath Scotty, sort of alone and unique, not one of the big three, but not one of the bottom three, we have Chekhov and Sulu and Ahura. Chekhov, of course, was added later, and there's a whole story about how Russians were offended that there was no Russian, even though they were the first into space. Of course, they gave him the haircut of one of the monkeys to make him more appealing to youth. And I've always thought it's interesting with Chekhov, we don't learn a lot about his background. He references Leningrad once when he makes a snarky comment that Scotch was invented by a little old lady from Leningrad. This would indicate that that city is renamed that at some point in the future, although not necessarily. My hope is that it is not. That this is not a communist reference, but probably the way he says it is a colloquialism of Russians by that time. A little old lady from Leningrad being something snippy that you would say in reference to something. We don't get a lot of details of his upbringing on screen. There's a lot of secondary canon. His life growing up on the moon, not having actually been to Russia till he was an adult, and that led to sort of his wanting to be Russian and sort of overcompensating. What I enjoy about it is that the Soviet communist Russians being so determined that they were being left out, and to their hilarity, and Star Trek adding a Russian character, but there's really nothing communist about Chekhov. Despite, he mentions Leningrad, I say that's a snippy sort of comment. But what you actually get from Chekhov, by all of his obsession with his Russian identity, is sort of a nationalism. He's very proud of being Russian, very determined about it, knowledgeable about it, cares about it in a way that is decidedly not communist. And so we do put a Russian on Star Trek, but you'd say he's a white Russian, not a red one. Lieutenant Ahura is an interesting case too. Of course, she didn't get nearly as much screen time as some of us would have liked, though she does definitely get her moments to shine. And there's a whole story about that, feeling that she wasn't getting enough time, wanting to quit, being encouraged to stay by Dr. Martin Luther King. That story is sort of out there and known. But I think the important part about Ahura, obviously, is that she's there, but also that she is African. We are presented with Nyota Ahura as one who speaks Swahili, and that comes up more than once throughout the series. Now, this is really ingenious, and this is part of the way Roddenberry is selling us characters based on their humanity, not on their tokenization, if that makes sense. Today, characters are added to shows, and the character is described as, non-binary genderqueer. Like, that's their character. Their sexual identity is their only defining characteristic. Chekhov, Sulu, and Ahura are people that are very ethnic, well, so is Scotty, very sort of ethnic. But even though they obviously have these characteristics that identify them ethnically, what we learn about them is entirely their professionalism, their capacity, their good officers. We learn about their humanity. We're intended to care about them as people, not as tokens. By the 1960s, you have this problem with the American left and the radical redefinition of race, which is completely fictitious and made up in order to create an ism. All of the riots, the controversies of the 60s being foisted by the radical and communist left. In order to put a black woman on the bridge, Roddenberry does this genius thing. Yeah, he definitely has a black woman on the bridge. She's African. By not having her be African American, he kind of sidesteps all of the ongoing controversies within the culture and all of the pushback or push forward, or whichever way you identify it as, with what was going on in the 60s. So Ahura is this character that has this rich history of being from Africa, or at least of African descent, and speaking Swahili. And that tweaks the character enough. And as I say, the most important thing we learn about her is that she's a capable officer that we're happy to have on the ship. She's never tokenized as, oh, by the way, here we have one of these because we're required to by law. Any of that sort of nonsense that comes later. Hikaru Sulu, we learn, is Japanese. Although if you look it up, Sulu does not appear to be a Japanese name. There is an island in the Pacific, however, that is named Sulu. Now, it's not really clear whether that was something that Gene Roddenberry found on a map. If there's information out there, at least I haven't read it. But having flown as a pilot in World War II against the Japanese, this is incredible. Gene Roddenberry wanted a Japanese pilot for his ship. He wanted a Japanese guy on the show. This says a ton about Gene Roddenberry and the experience of going to war even, but being able to do this without malice or prejudice afterwards. That what he learned was to admire the skill set and wanting to put a Japanese pilot on the show flying his starship. But again, the main point of Sulu's character is not his identity. We're meant to find him as a capable officer. His capability and skill are referenced many times. And he is not tokenized or stereotyped in any sort of fashion. Mr. Scott is an interesting character, also European, but very ethnic. It puts him as Northern European, British Isles, not Russian. And so we get this, I hate to even say the word because it's a communist buzzword of our time, but we have actual real representation at this time. And Scotty still has the accent. This is one of the beautiful anti-communist things about it. And I've done whole videos on how, of course, Star Trek is not communist and it is not woke. You can look those up elsewhere on my channel. But because they all have their own accents, they do speak Swahili. Sulu has a samurai sword at one point. Right? Chekhov has an accent, talks about Leningrad. These are not people who have been put through the meat grinder of communist woke and are all indistinguishable comrades with matching bowl cuts. Scotty wears a kilt for crying out loud. We get that all of these separate rich cultural heritages still exist. They peacefully coexist and are mutually respected. That is absolutely the opposite of the extreme left that wants to destroy everything as some kind of ism archaeobia. Now, Scott, at various times, interchangeably with Sulu, is sort of third in command of the Enterprise. Sometimes he's in command when Captain Kirk and Mr. Spock are gone. Sometimes it's Mr. Sulu. It's not real clear, although because Scotty does say throughout and all the way till Star Trek The Next Generation that he's much happier being an engineer even when he becomes a captain later by rank. It's not surprising then that they're still tweaking the character, and he'll be left in command because he's qualified, but would it be his first choice? And it's also who's with the away team rather than a formal third in command. It seems that there's a few people to choose from. And I think it's only in the mirror universe that it is made clear there that Sulu is third in command of that Enterprise. But when you're talking about the Terran Empire, which is a police state, of course your security chief is going to be your next in command of the ship. Scotty also sometimes, in fact, in the mirror universe, he does actually refer to Captain Kirk by his first name. The lower ranking folks, so to speak, Chekhov, Sulu, and Ahura don't do that as regularly. But I don't think we see that at all until the films. That would be a bit of trivia. Whereas when they're beaming away and Scotty wants to stay, he's Jim. And I believe more than once in the series. So he's on a first name basis with Captain Kirk, and yet he's not the right and left hand man. Now, when we're talking about Spock and McCoy and Kirk, this is interesting. I said he's Horatio Hornblower. He is the incredible alpha male James T. Kirk, the guy that knows what he's doing. But the way that this is written, and this is what's so compelling about all this, in the relationships, he's got these men that even Captain Kirk knows that he's not perfect. He's not a perfect know-it-all, though he always comes through in a pinch. We're given a broader view of his humanity. And oddly enough, we get part of his humanity in Mr. Spock. Mr. Spock, who is logical, scientific, and rational, but not coldly so, not in a grim reality sort of way, because he is half human. So now we've introduced biracialism into this, and again, sort of avoided any of the ongoing connotations of our culture by having Spock be half alien, but giving him this perfect logic, which is also alien to humanity, but colored with enough humanity that he's not coldly so. So Spock is the perfect right-hand man for Kirk, being someone that is logical, knowledgeable, rational, and yet not without some compassion. Whereas McCoy is completely emotional. And again, keeping with the geographical diversity, not really racial diversity as people will emphasize. You've got Scotty and Chekhov from different parts of Europe. McCoy is from the South, likes to cook up bourbon and beans, occasionally has a soft accent, though he kind of moves in and out of it, as a lot of intellectuals from the South were doing at the time, sadly, trying to break the stereotype of ignorance that is sometimes associated wrongly with the Southern drawl. But McCoy moves smoothly in and out of those accents. He's clearly Southern, and he's the doctor, the humanitarian, the humanist, the guy who's all passion, all mercy, compassion. He's the emotional. He's the opposite of Spock in the sense that he's very emotional, sensitive, intuitive. He serves as the ship's counselor, really, in a time when they don't have an official one, at least not until the web series Star Trek Continues, which was a great development. So McCoy has all this humanity about him, but he's also a scientist. He's a medical doctor, a surgeon. He's got to do a little bit of everything. In our time, people specialize already, but he's identified as ship's surgeon in several episodes, chief medical officer, ship's doctor. He has a variety of different ways that his job is described, but the essence of it is what? that he is covering the whole medical spectrum, but he is a scientist. So the opposite of Spock, who was all reason with a little emotion, McCoy is very sensitive and emotional, but he has got that little bit of science in there. And all of this makes this perfect rotation as these guys orbit Kirk, because these are different aspects of Kirk whom we see clearly is knowledgeable, reasonable, and very emotional, and having these manifestations of his own inner conflict like broadened makes them the perfect advisors to give him more information when he doesn't have it, to give him more feeling when maybe he didn't think of it or feel it quite fully. He gets this full picture. This is part of the beauty of this whole series, and this is why ultimately this is why it works. Even as science fiction-y, it's got all that ingenious stuff that's still out there, but as a basic core human story, even with our aliens being representations of humanity, it comes back to being a very human story, classic, timeless, and something we can all empathize, sympathize, relate to. And I want to emphasize that, because more and more with this ridiculous woke tokenization, when people, their character is only who they want to have sex with or what they look like, this idea that people need to be represented somehow. If there's not one of me on the screen, then it's not written for me. This is hogwash. I don't know who began indoctrinating people with this, but if you can't look at any story about any human and relate as a human, then you were already programmed and brainwashed or something. You were already given a wrong view of the world. If you look at a World War II video game and say, well, there's no women combatants, so it's not for me or about me, sniffle, sniffle, somebody raised you wrong. Somebody should be teaching you what actually happened in actual history. You can look at Star Trek and you can empathize with any of these people, regardless of their race or anything else going on. All of the spectrum is there. There's something for all of us to grab onto. And really, this is why it worked in its time. And sadly, this is why the new versions of it really stink. Because now we have tokenized characters, we have swapped out characters, because as if Star Trek wasn't human enough, representative enough, as if Star Trek were lacking this. No, the modern audience that they're aiming at is lacking it, because those people are pathologically demented. But the original Star Trek, the thing that really sells all of the wonderful science fiction involved, ends up being the core humanity that is carried with them into this future and into those strange new worlds.